Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to address you on the very relevant topic of good governance. Permit me to commend the government for initiating this Congress during a period when there is a lot of debate regarding the governance at government-owned companies and the role of the government therein. Also allow me to congratulate the organizers for putting the program for this Congress together. In particular, I wish to single out Mr. Frank Kuhneman, who invited me to speak. It is my hope that this Congress will contribute to the strengthening of the corporate governance framework and practices on St. Martin. Ladies and gentlemen, in the next few minutes, well, more like many minutes, I shall, as a result, speak on the topic corporate governance in St. Martin, evolution, importance, and principles, with a focus on government-owned companies. To begin, I will briefly discuss the definition and rationale of corporate governance. I will then provide an overview of the evolution and structure of the corporate governance system on St. Martin, followed by some suggestions for improvements. I shall end with some concluding remarks. Imagine that AI was managing director and supervisory director and shareholder. The world will look quite different, I believe. The debate on corporate governance is a centuries-old debate and long before AI came into being. During my economics studies, I was introduced, not personally, but I was introduced to a well-known Scottish economist and philosopher, Adam Smith. In his comprehensive studies of an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations in 1776, he made the following observation about corporations, and I quote, "The directors of such companies, however being the managers rather of other people's money than of their own, it cannot well be expected that they should watch over it with the same anxious vigilance with which the partners in a private co-partnery frequently watch over their own," unquote. That is some real old English. His observation lies at the heart of the debate on the need for good corporate governance in general and for government-owned companies in particular. That is the need to have effective controls. This is checks and balances through, among others, functional accountability, transparency, and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that decisions in government and businesses are made effectively, efficiently, fairly, and with integrity. Since Adam Smith's observation, there have been many studies on the factors and importance of good governance for economic development and growth. The general conclusion is that the better the level of governance, the higher the level of well-being and the stronger our communities. To discuss the developments in governance in St. Martin, it is essential to first establish what corporate governance entails. A review of the literature reveals that there are several definitions of the concept. Whereas each has its own focus and purpose, there is large agreement regarding the basic principles of governance, such as responsibility, accountability, and transparency, as you have heard earlier. The corporate governance principles developed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in its 1999 report and revised in its 2004 and 2015 reports, have become the international benchmark for governments and private sector reform initiatives. In its 2015 report, the OECD states, corporate governance involves a set of relationships between a company's management, its board, its shareholders, and other stakeholders. Corporate governance also provides the structures through which the objectives of the company are set and the means of attaining those objectives and monitoring performance are determined. The OECD's description indicates that corporate governance is an interactive process between the parties involved with the business. That process takes place based on a set of rules and norms for corporate behavior between internal and external stakeholders. Rules and norms which create a system of checks and balances between all parties involved to realize the objectives of sound management and the continuity of the company. Corporate governance thus refers to the responsibility and accountability of managing boards and of the supervisory board of a corporation towards its stakeholders. In short, corporate governance is the system by which companies are directed and controlled. Corporate governance is the system by which companies are directed and controlled. The key question is, why do we need checks and balances to foster good governance in firms? English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes offers an answer to that question in his 1651 book, The Leviathan. Paraphrasing the words of Thomas Hobbes, and I want you to listen carefully, checks and balances is a societal imperative, not because man is naturally bad, but because man is by nature more individualistic than social. Checks and balances is a societal imperative, not because man is naturally bad, but because man is by nature more individualistic than social. Do you agree? This brings me back to my old university friend and acquaintance, Adam Smith. Adam Smith, in his 1776 book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, considering the separation between owners as providers of capital for firms and managers of those firms, provides the following perspective to the question why we need good corporate governance. Rephrasing his words, Adam Smith asserts, because the managing directors of such companies are the managers of other people's money rather than of their own, it cannot be expected that they will watch over it with the same vigilance as the managing shareholder will watch over their own money. I see some people shaking their heads. Adam Smith's perspective raises an additional, interesting, and complicating matter in the case of government-owned corporations. That is, that the shareholder, this is the government, and the management, and the supervisory directors are, in none of the cases, managers, are, in all of the cases, managers of other people's assets. So in the case of government-owned companies, the shareholder, the supervisory board, and the management are all managers of other people's assets. Corporate law has, as a result, always included provisions to promote reasonable, fair, and proper corporate behavior. Corporate developments over the years have, however, prompted the need to strengthen and introduce additional rules and standards for corporate behavior. Noteworthy corporate behavior or misbehavior are a number of billion-dollar accounting fraud cases involving overstating revenues in the early 2000s, namely at American companies, Enron in 2001, and WorldCom in 2002, and at the Dutch company Ahold in 2003. This has led to corporate governance initiatives and regulatory reforms in several countries based on the recommendations of the OECD and similar reports, such as the 1997 report of the Peters Commissie in the Netherlands. Relevant examples are the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 in the United States and the Tabaksblad Code of 2003 in the Netherlands. The latter has been revised several times and is referred to as the Corporate Governance Code of the Netherlands. Songs like this Corporate Governance Code of St. Martin. That is not by chance. The focus of these regulatory and other corporate governance initiatives is on establishing and ensuring adherence to the core principles of corporate governance. Addressing the concerns raised by Adam Smith, these include provisions pertaining to the behavior of shareholders, supervisory directors, and managing directors regarding core governance principles such as responsibility, accountability, integrity and conflict of interest, fairness, transparency, independence, and competence. These principles are relevant for all stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, creditors, auditors, regulators, and customers of the company. The primary focus, however, is on the relationship between and the behavior of shareholders, supervisory directors, and managing directors. This relationship only works when the protocols or the system of rules are followed. A key focus in that regard is the division of decision-making authority between the shareholders and the board of directors and managing directors. This core corporate law principle, which I like to compare with the trias politica doctrine of constitutional law, is essential in creating checks and balances in corporations. Essential to prevent a concentration of power and/or an emergence of unchecked power with the associated problems of misuse or abuse of power, conflict of interest, withholding information, and non-reporting and the like. This sort of corporate behavior invariably leads to problems. A recent example in this regard is the collapse of the crypto giant FTX in November of 2022. AI seemingly didn't work. This raises the question, how is the corporate governance system regulated on St. Martin? Attention for corporate governance increased substantially on St. Martin during the late 1990s. No doubt because of international developments in general and in the Netherlands, but also because of local developments. A survey of the St. Martin economy and its development shows that St. Martin has evolved into a service economy with a dominant tourism sector since the 1960s. With a myriad of small, medium, and large private corporations in sectors such as hotels, restaurants, banking, insurance, logistics, retail, and wholesale operations. The government is also a very significant participant in critical fields such as transportation, energy and water, communication, healthcare, social housing, and social security through government-owned companies, government foundations, and public legal entities. Interesting to note is that initially, government's participation came about by taking over private corporations with the participation and nationalization of GB in 1960 and Winair in 1974, followed by a process of privatization of government departments with the incorporation of Telem in 1975, PGIA in 1983, and the St. Martin Ports Authority, now known as the St. Martin Harbor Group of Companies, in 1989. The corporate structures of these government-owned companies have since undergone significant changes to reflect structural, organizational, and other changes, but also to improve corporate governance. The corporate governance changes came about because of a number of corporate governance failures at government-owned companies in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Noteworthy are, first, the $35 million Italian construction loan scandal at PGIA in 1989, which involved overreaching by the supervisory board and government. Second, the $2.4 million YS-11 in Fusa aircraft lease fraud at Winair in 1990, which involved the unchecked actions by the management. And third, the EMG conflict of interest at NVGEBE in 1993, which involved the lack of separation between management and supervisory board. So as you see, we also had our own scandals. These cases led to major liquidity and solvency problems that threatened the continuity of these companies. They exposed weaknesses in the checks and balances at these and other government-owned companies. That resulted in an erosion of investors' confidence in these companies, and with that, their ability to finance investments in critical infrastructure and services for the economic development and growth of St. Martin. The government, in response and out of necessity, developed and implemented a number of corporate governance reforms. The reforms initially centered on the so-called arm's length. Many politicians don't like to hear the word. Arm's length principle, which concerned measures to promote the observance of rules regarding the separation of responsibilities of the government as shareholder vis-à-vis the supervisory board and the managing board. These measures included restructuring of the corporate structure of the government-owned companies via the introduction of new articles of incorporations. Important changes included the introduction of the holding structure aimed at placing a buffer between the government and the management of the company, and the introduction of the so-called independent supervisory board structure to reduce the influence of the government as shareholder in the recruitment process for management and supervisory directors. These arm's length measures seek to address the dominant position of the shareholder, read the government, which has the tendency to use its power to achieve goals that are different from the objectives of the sound management and continuity of the company. They were, starting in 1996, at the airport, implemented in varying degrees and forms at other government-owned companies. The arm's length measures were followed by the introduction of corporate governance regulations for government-owned companies, which are corporations and foundations, in 2009. These regulations include the National Ordinance Corporate Governance, the National Decree Corporate Governance Code containing general measures, and the National Decree regulating the establishment of the Corporate Governance Council. Noteworthy is that these regulations came about following the political agreement made between the Netherlands, the former Netherlands Antilles, Curaçao, and St. Martin in the Bel Air Community Center here in St. Martin on January 22nd, 2008, as part of the negotiations regarding the constitutional reform process. Sounds a lot like the current B15, you said? This has led to the current corporate governance regime on St. Martin, which consists of the following components, namely binding regulations for all companies as stipulated in the Civil Code, Book 2, specific regulations for financial institutions, and 3, specific corporate governance regulations for government-owned companies. It is not my intention to discuss these regulations in detail. Important to note is that the purpose of the regulations is to formalize the principles of good corporate governance and the mechanisms to ensure or promote compliance. This is not to say that there is no room for improvement. To the contrary, the issues have not disappeared. There have been voices opposing and questioning the need for the system. And that lack of commitment and support have led to the first Corporate Governance Council's resignation out of protest in 2013. This and recent developments at PGIA and the GEBE give rise to concern and the need for greater commitment to and observance of corporate governance principles. Drawing from these experiences and considering the special nature of government-owned companies, I wish to highlight 5 prerequisites, or rather commandments, to promote and improve good corporate governance. The first commandment is this: the company's interest is paramount. The company's interest is paramount. It is the raison d'être of the company. The behavior or the actions of all stakeholders must be guided by the interests of the company. All stakeholders must be committed to realizing the company's objectives, which is its bottom line of profitability and continuity. This commandment is self-evident, or should be, and need no further explanation. The second commandment is this: there shall be competent management. There shall be competent management. It is a prerequisite to secure the realization of the objectives of the company. It calls for the strengthening of procedures to recruit competent management and to ensure that the management, and only the management, manages the company in accordance with the interests of the company. Despite the fact that the role of the managing board is clearly regulated by law, one sometimes, or too often, hear the remark that a supervisory director and/or a politician sits in the chair of the management, or that they co-manage the company. For the record, the tendency of supervisory directors to co-manage is not limited to St. Martin or government-owned companies. If and insofar as this happens, it may be clear that this is not in line with the principles of good governance as outlined earlier. It is a breakdown of the good governance separation of decision-making principle. This competent management commandment also involves establishing a management profile based on competence requirements in terms of qualifications, expertise, experience, integrity, and authority. Respected, qualified, expert, experienced, and honest management results in a strong, competent management which will ensure that a company's policy is developed and, once established, that it is implemented. A competent, that is, reputable and experienced management is much more likely to withstand the pressures of politicians or supervisory directors desiring to co-manage. Competent management is by far the most important factor in a well-run and profitable business. Compliance with the competent management commandment is a prerequisite for good corporate governance and thus securing of the company's interests. It is, in addition to the competent management commandment, critical to monitor the performance of management. The third commandment, therefore, is this: there shall be effective supervision. There shall be effective supervision. This commandment is similar to the second in that effective supervision calls for competent supervisory directors who, in accordance with existing rules and regulations, supervise, advise, and select the management board, all in the interest of the company. The role of the supervisory director vis-à-vis the management places high standards on the competencies of the supervisory board, given that competent management is by far, as I said, the most important factor in a well-run and profitable business. In this context, the supervisory directors have a pivotal role to play in promoting good corporate governance. As with the managing board, the selection and appointment of supervisory board of directors must therefore be subject to requirements with regard to the composition and with regard to the profile in terms of experience, qualifications, expertise, independence, and integrity. The independence, expertise, and integrity of supervisory directors promote effective, balanced, and transparent decision-making. It also helps to avoid the practice of co-managing and to prevent that the actions of the management go unchecked. Strengthening the selection process to ensure effective supervision is a prerequisite for the improvement of corporate governance of government-owned companies, as well as their performance. This brings me to the fourth commandment, which is establish and honor a strategic business plan. Establish and honor a strategic business plan. The strategic business plan commandment is an important issue in the corporate relationship between the government as shareholder, the supervisory board, and the managing board of government-owned companies, but also in the relationship between management as representative of the company and, for example, the employees. This is because it is not always clear what objective the government as shareholder pursues with the company. Having an approved broad-based business plan with a long-term vision and set objectives based on the profitability and continuity of the company is a key instrument for promoting good governance. It creates a clear and transparent framework for the management and staff to achieve and report on goals, for the supervisory board to be able to exercise effective supervision based on the achieved results, for the shareholders to enforce accountability by the managing and supervisory boards, and for external stakeholders, including creditors, who intend to invest long-term money in the company. Out of experience, I can tell you, arriving at a widely supported and securing adherence to the strategic business plan for a government-owned company is not an easy task. It is therefore all the more important to secure competent management and effective supervision to guide this critical process in the interests of the company. And the fifth commandment is this: there shall be optimum transparency. It addresses the vital issue of confidence and trust in the fiduciary relationship between the corporate bodies of the corporation and the other stakeholders in the company. This is particularly relevant for government-owned companies. Confidence and trust between the management, supervisory board, and the shareholder are essential for the proper functioning of the corporate governance system. This is strengthened and fostered by open, honest, and transparent reporting and exchange of information. The public, in keeping with the OECD corporate governance definition and the St. Martin Corporate Governance Code, is an important stakeholder in government-owned companies. This because they are users of the services, but also because government-owned companies are different from private corporations in that the people are the actual shareholders. Existing accountability and transparency provisions are largely designed for the relationship between the management, the supervisory board, and the suppliers of capital, read the shareholders and creditors. The existing rules and regulations, generally speaking, leaves the actual shareholders, the people, out in the dark. Optimum transparency calls for the timely completion and publication of the audited financial statements, as well as information regarding financial transactions between the company, the managing directors, the supervisory directors, and the shareholder, read government officials. Financial transactions include compensation data, travel data, and dividends, and the like. Optimum transparency strengthens the corporate governance checks and balances system and helps to secure the realization of the company's objectives. Strict compliance in the areas of these 5 commandments is critical for the improvement of good governance in government-owned companies. It is therefore recommended to apply the comply or else approach to the 5 commandments as opposed to the comply or explain approach. Such an approach calls for enhanced enforcement mechanisms via, for example, the Corporate Governance Council. In conclusion, I will leave you with the following thoughts. First, businesses benefit from adhering to the principles of good corporate governance. That is the case for private as well as government-owned companies. Past and recent international and local cases show that corporate governance failures always come with high cost to the people in terms of loss of jobs, loss of income, and loss of wealth, and an increase in debt. This means that good corporate governance is a societal imperative and warrants giving it the required priority on government's socio-economic policy agenda. Second, this social imperative has led to numerous initiatives to reform and strengthen corporate governance around the world and on St. Martin since the 1990s. The system needs improvement. Third, recent developments at government-owned companies show that there is room for improvement in the level of corporate governance. In that regard, it is recommended that the focus be on 5 corporate governance commandments: commitment to the company's interest, competent management, effective supervision, strategic planning, and optimum transparency. That, along with the application of the comply or else approach with the associated enforcement mechanisms. The application and observance of all 5 corporate governance commandments will increase accountability, help stakeholders fulfill their responsibilities better, improve the performance of government-owned companies, and contribute to the effective functioning and growth of our economy. And finally, it must be stated that these commandments and all corporate governance rules will ultimately only be effective if the stakeholders internalize the inherent principles and adhere to the underlying standards of reasonableness, fairness, and propriety in their conduct. For after all is said and done, rules can promote, but are no substitute for good behavior. Thank you.